that are going to be coming in. So just be aware of it. You know, I really try to fight for a buyer to have a due diligence period, have those inspectors, termite, have everybody lined up, ready to go, try to get it. If you cannot get a due diligence period, Gar does have a form. I don't like the form because it's very confusing to people, but there's a right to request property sold with right to request repairs exhibit. If you can't get due diligence, that would be the next best thing. It gives the buyer an opportunity to request repairs if there are defects identified in a home inspection report. If I am with a seller, right, I would almost argue it's better to let the buyer have a day or two, 3 days of due diligence versus the right to request repairs. How many of us have seen a squeaky clean home inspection come back? So if something's not in good working order, it's considered a defect. So just give them a few days. Let them just have a clear way out. Don't get in, you know, I'm trying to set us up where we don't have these disputes later by doing the homework on the front end. So, and when it comes to option money, popular in some states, it's still not super popular in Georgia, but option money is literally an option for a buyer. They can pay for the due diligence period. I would argue, you know, even though I don't like option money because it goes directly to the seller, it's non-refundable unless the seller were to default, but then good luck, right? Getting it back from the seller to seller defaults in some cases, I would imagine. So, but if you can't get a due diligence, and the only way you can get it is with option money, usually that corresponds with the number of days. So I'm having 3 days due diligence, maybe there's $500 earnest money. I'm having 10 days, it might be a couple of grand. So usually the amount of money and the amount of time, there's a relationship between those two. Don't see people using option money very rarely, even in the market, even with the multiple offers, but it is there. If you are going to use it, same thing as of the offer date within a certain number of days, it either will or will not be applied toward the purchase. I absolutely would say that it will be applied toward their purchase. I want the buyer to get credit for it. Otherwise, it's just money they're paying to the seller for nothing other than literally just for the due diligence. I know that was a lot of information about earnest money and due diligence, you guys. If anybody has any questions about these part, I'd love to take those now. I will say that a buyer can terminate for any reason at all during the due diligence period. They could wake up one day and decide they don't want to buy the house for any reason. One reason why sellers are leery of it and listing agents are a little bit leery of it. The right to inspect the property just in general runs the life of the contract. So due diligence period expires, but the buyer wants to go out and take a look at something or have an inspector come out and look at something. Contractually, they can do that. Sometimes that will come up as a question for sure. And we're almost at our break, you guys, is as is. If a property is sold as is, still recommend an inspection. The seller still has a duty to disclose latent or hidden defects. And as is really, what it really means is the seller is not willing to make repairs. And they're saying, look, you know, we're probably have priced the home in consideration of the repairs, and usually they're obvious that they're not willing to make. Could a buyer still ask for it? Sure, a buyer could still propose amendments, and sometimes sellers will go ahead and agree to make those changes, even if originally they decided not to, because maybe they're getting a really good price for the property. Lead-based paint, just quickly here, if it was built before 78, it's required by the EPA. You want to have it completed and attached to the contract, not a stip that says you'll get it in the future, not attached blank, needs to be filled out. So if it's a listed property that was built before 78, a good listing agent would have that. A lot of times it'll be an attachment to the listing in the MLS. There's no exception to that. Super important. Brokerage relationships. You're simply going to disclose the type of relationship that you have with the parties. In our example, the buyer is a client, seller is a customer. You'll never check number 3 because we don't offer dual. You check number 4 if it's the same company. Believe it or not, even though we have 2 companies and we close thousands of deals a year, very rarely, usually it's realty on one side and Georgia on the other. But if it is truly the same company and there is a client relationship on both ends, you can go ahead with number 4, and then you'd fill in the agent working with those folks. Material disclosure. If you know the party outside of the transaction, as a rule of thumb, folks usually disclose it. A lot of agents over disclose. Technically, it's only a relationship that you would have with the other side of the deal that can impact the transaction. If you have a relationship with the party on your side, you're already representing them. It's usually not that big of a deal. As a general rule of thumb, over disclosure is never going to hurt anything. So most folks do over disclose and there's no problem with it. If you are an agent, you need to disclose that you as the buyer or the seller hold a Georgia real estate license and list your license number. This is a great place. You could use special stips, but this is a great place to do that. Well, a material relationship, really the way Gar looks at it, is a relationship that you would have with like the seller that could impact negotiations. Probably a good example in our case today, let's say the seller that maybe I've worked with the seller to sell other homes as a client. Maybe I've worked with that seller to buy homes as a buyer. They're a former client. Maybe the seller is a relative. Maybe I'm not close to them, but they're still a relative. That would be something that I would consider to be more of a material relationship, and I would disclose. If I have a relationship with the buyer, that technically doesn't have to be disclosed here. If you want to go ahead and disclose it, and a lot of us do, no problem. Time limit's not required. A reasonable time limit can be a good idea. If it's a weekend, if it's a holiday, if there's tons of offers and we know that the seller is not going to review the offers until Friday, you want to keep all that in mind. If you don't put a time limit here and the buyer goes under contract on another deal, you could always go back and withdraw this offer. Gar has a form to withdraw an offer or a counter offer. So usually I do go ahead and put in a time frame, even if it's 5 days down the road, just so there is a certain time that the offer can expire and we can truly not worry about it. So, all right, you guys, we got a minute. I'm glad everybody's doing well. Okay. I did get a couple of questions during the break from some folks here in Roswell asking me about the earnest money and the due diligence period and what if that buyer actually terminates the contract. And so if the buyer doesn't have due diligence, but the earnest money is due within a number of days and they terminate, even though they don't have a right to terminate, but the earnest money wasn't due yet, do they still owe it? Yes, they still owe the seller the earnest money. Now, what if, though, the buyer has a due diligence period? What if they have 5 days due diligence, and also 5 days to turn in the earnest money, but they terminate on the 4th day? What then? Well, no, they don't have to turn it in. If they terminate, they truly terminate before it's due and they had a right to terminate. On those termination forms, if we have time, we'll look at one today. There's 2 things that the Gar Termination Form does. It terminates the contract, and it also, the bottom half of the form is a proposed disbursement of earnest money. So you would just simply put NA for not applicable or just leave it blank. I'm a fan of NA for the earnest money portion of it. But Gar has a unilateral termination and a mutual termination. And I know that none of us are really experts, and hopefully we won't have to be on terminations, but I do want everybody just to understand the difference between a unilateral termination and a mutual termination. So we'll touch base on that today. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and re-share my screen because we just finished the very first page of the 8 pages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fast forward to page 7 of 8, but not to belittle in any way these other pages. Again, the contract is a set of instructions. It's a set of remedies to problems. And I do strongly encourage everyone to go back and read all of the other pages of the contract. If you're like me, I have to read something 3 times. If it's something like this, to really grasp all of it, then read it 3 times. Read it however long you need to, however many times you need to. Knowing the contract just kind of helps to point you in the right direction for sure. And of course, we're here to help too. You can always call or email us during the week and we're happy to help you. We have online 24/7 resources if it is after hours. So the page 7 of the GAR contract, I'll zoom out just a little bit. It does two really important things. One is it addresses attachments, exhibits, and the other thing it does is there's a section for special stipulations. So if something's not referenced as being attached, then it's not a part of the contract. So the contract, think about it like four corners, like a box. You want everything in writing. You want everything inside of that box. So if there is a conventional loan and we want to make this contract contingent on a conventional loan, we are absolutely going to check that box and we're going to give it a letter of the alphabet. Exhibits are alphabetical and amendments are numerical. That is just standard. It's not a rule per se in the contract, but that is what is industry standard. That's what I want you to do. So typically go in line of financing exhibits, seller disclosures. You know, if you have other exhibits, you're just going to go down the line and give those other assignments here. Now, in our example today, we've only got that conventional loan exhibit, so I'm only going to leave that. GAR kind of helps us out. They go ahead and list all the common exhibits here. Seller's disclosure, community association disclosure, super common and popular exhibits to have. If it happens to be an exhibit that's not referenced here, we can use the other field and simply go ahead and reference what it's going to be. So pretty simple with exhibits. Special stipulations. So the section for special stipulations is super small. It gets smaller over the years. It used to fill up almost the entire page. And now if you use a healthy stipulation like a gap clause, it's not even going to fit. You're going to have to use an additional page. So just know that. Now, people will ask me, I'm going to park here and talk about special stipulations for just a second, because folks will ask me pretty regularly, what special stipulations do I recommend as a broker to be attached to the contract? I actually don't have any standard special stipulations that I say, hey, always throw these in there. Some brokerage firms who represent investors who are purchasing property to rent them out have 10 to 20, sometimes they'll have their own additional pages they will attach to protect themselves. And it's kind of just, they attach that to every offer they make. We don't really have that. You know, every contract is unique. Every deal is unique. And I'm not a fan of special stipulations in general. If we don't need them, then I wouldn't put any in. So I would not reiterate anything that's already in the contract, because of the fact that special stipulations prevail over all other terms. So if I reiterate a term and I don't get it exactly right, I could be creating a problem. I could be overriding something that I really don't want to override. Now, if it's a situation where I need to use a special stipulation, instead of writing my own, I'm going to check and see what GAR has. If I'm using RE forms, I'm going to check and see what RE has. And check there first, because those are special stipulations approved by GAR. They're approved by attorneys on the GAR forms committee, and those you can trust. Now, if there's not a special stipulation, I can't find one, I'm going to utilize our broker team. We have, again, 2 attorneys who are fabulous on our team. They can always help. If you are choosing to write one on your own anyway, I know it happens. I am going to be really careful. I'm going to look at what GAR has, maybe mirror mine after GAR's. Who, what, when, and what if. Who is going to do what? When are they going to do it by? And what if they don't do it? That's just a simple formula that you can kind of follow. Now, this special stipulation that's here is one we've baked into the contract for you just to help you, just in case you accidentally reference Georgia as the earnest money holder. Now, you guys have been doing a fabulous job. I haven't had this as an issue. If you need this space and you want to remove it, then take it away. Maybe Weissman's the holder. Say, Derek, Solid Source is not even the holder. I don't need that stip there. Then put it in the trash can and get rid of it. I will not be offended at all. I am going to show you how to pull up special steps though, because I do get this question on a pretty regular basis. And so what you actually are going to do is you're just going to click in this box. Now this works also if you're using the additional page by some chance, if you have an array of special steps and you need it. You're just going to click and it's going to prompt you for add a clause or create a new one. Create a new one means writing your own. So again, we're going to try to avoid doing that. I'm going to click on add clause. Now, once I do that, now because I'm zoomed in, it's kind of, there we go. It's going to take me to this pop-up window and it's going to show me different folders. Now, maybe I'm going to use a Gar special step and I already know it's a Gar step and I'm going to go there. Maybe I really honestly don't know where it is. You'll notice I have this bad step examples here just for our class today. But let's say I'm looking for that gap clause, right? And I'm just going to put in gap because I have no idea where it is. Okay, so 3 come up for me. I see appraisal gap absolute, appraisal gap revised, and appraisal gap changes. You won't see all 3 of these. I just put two bad steps to talk about today in my own folder. You have the ability to create your own packages. You have the ability to create your own stipulations. If there was one that maybe one of our attorneys helped you draft and you just need to use that again and you have it saved, you could always go back to it. So Remind will let you do that. Yeah. But you can also click on preview and take a look at it. Now, I happen to know that this one is one Seth Weissman provided, and this one's been tucked away in your folder. So I want to use this one. So once I've confirmed that's it, I'm just going to click add clause and then done. Now, it's not going to let me essentially because of the size of the special stipulation. So what I'm going to do in that case is it's actually not going to put it there. Okay. So I'm going to need to look at that I'm going to need to attach an additional page to have that stipulation. So I'm just going to back out of this long enough to go to the additional page. And I forgot to pull it in. I just wasn't thinking, it slipped my mind. So to pull it in, I'm just going to go to form. And you guys, there's a couple of different ways you can pull forms into here. Just as a side note, I probably left this out earlier. You can upload. So if you had a builder contract and maybe the buyer brokerage originated here and you want to keep everything nice and neat in your folder, you can upload it. Something else that's super cool is you can email it here. Every transaction you create in Remind has its own email address. So you could email all those builder documents right into this. Give it a few minutes when you do that. They will show up here. Super helpful. But this is a Gar form. It's a smart form. I know it's an additional page. I don't know the form number, but I'm assuming additional's in there. Let's see, signature page, additional page, generic additional page. It's going to be this F801. So I'm just going to pull that in and quickly go to that. And I could make it additional page A to purchase and sale agreement. You know, I can enter in this basic information here. But once again, all we have to do is click in the box, add clause. And now I'm kind of going to repeat the same thing because it was too big to add it on the other one. I'm just going to go ahead and dump it in here. There you go. So that is the special stipulation. It's healthy. It covers everything that needs to be covered in a good special stipulation coming from Seth Weissman. All I have to do is click in the blank and I can fill in the options here. I will just say as a warning, and I'm going to go ahead and pull in some of these bad steps because I am going to talk about this gap step for a little bit here too. So everybody, if you may not be familiar but appraisal gap clauses, an appraisal gap clause is a special stipulation, and it's wildly popular. I get probably at least a question a day about it still from someone, if not every day, at least a couple times a week. And essentially what it is, it's a special stipulation, and it is an appraisal contingency. So in a normal market, the appraisal contingencies, and with the GAR forms, the appraisal contingencies are baked into the financing exhibits. Even on the cash, if you use a cash exhibit, you have an opportunity to opt into an appraisal contingency. Well, what most appraisal contingencies are going to say is that the property doesn't appraise for the purchase price. Then the buyer either has an opportunity to terminate. It'll be a blanket statement like in the amendatory clause, or it'll be a step-by-step process, such as what is in the conventional loan exhibit and the cash exhibit, saying if the property doesn't appraise, you can request a price reduction. If the price reduction is not accepted, you have so many days, it's not open-ended, so many days that you can terminate. Well, in the extreme market that we're in, many buyers are coming back and saying, look, prices are going up super fast, appraisals aren't coming in, we don't want to lose the deal, we want the seller to take our offer, we're willing to pay the difference. Maybe that difference, that gap is $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, $50,000. I've seen over $100,000, believe it or not. Folks are willing to pay the difference. So that is the amount that is filled into this blank. I'm just going to say that the difference today is going to be, I'm just going to say it's $10,000. You also have another blank to fill in, and that's the number of days that the buyer has to terminate if the gap exceeds that. So I'm just going to say 2 days. Sounds pretty reasonable. So the buyer, in this case of an appraisal gap clause, the one that Seth has given us, if the property appraises for $10,000 or less of a gap, the buyer is obligated to move forward and close. They're going to bring the cash themselves to close the deal. If that difference is $11,000, if it's $10,001, if it exceeds the 10, then the buyer has an opportunity to terminate within 2 days. So it's not open-ended. So within 2 days to actually terminate the deal. So kind of makes sense, right? Can be confusing once you kind of, I think the light kind of goes off, at least went off for me when it first came out, understanding it is an appraisal contingency. It's just for a lesser amount than the purchase price. Some of the issues with the special stipulation, though, if you do use it, is just to understand special stips prevail, but they don't prevail over any amendatory clause. So GAR made that change this year. So if it's an FHA loan, if it's a VA loan, you cannot override their amendatory clause, which is a blanket appraisal contingency. So when you're dealing with an FHA or a VA loan, I would not recommend an appraisal gap clause. People still use it anyway, but just know that the buyer, you just can't stipulate your way around the buyer's right to terminate if it doesn't appraise and them getting their earnest money back. So just use it with that awareness. Some of the other issues with the stip that I want you guys to be aware of is agents who write their own. And every brokerage company is different. We have this in the packages. I don't know that every broker is going to have packages and those special stipulations there. See a lot of variations of the special stipulations. When I get calls and there's problems, usually it's a very short stipulation, such as the ones in my bad examples today. And these are, I'm going to read these real quick. The buyer shall pay $25,000 over the appraised value not to exceed $425,000. What does this really do? The purchase price is $425,000. What if it appraises at $300,000? The buyer, oftentimes in this case, thinks that now they're getting the house for $325,000. That can turn into a problem. Again, we're trying to set up a contract so smooth, so clean. We're trying to avoid that ambiguous, avoid those disputes back until we want it to be as clear as possible. So this one comes up routinely as a problem. Another one, if the property appraises for less than the purchase price, buyer will pay the difference. They're not capped at anything unless the buyer truly has cash funds and they can pay the whole price in cash, this is probably not a good idea. I will say I've talked to agents who have used this one in some instances where the buyer could have paid cash and they understood that. Oftentimes it's a case where they just, an agent with another firm, but put the special stipulation in there, was in a hurry and wasn't thinking about. So while we hate to think about worst case, we need to think about worst case to protect our clients, especially when it comes to special stip. So if we're putting this in there, think about worst case, think about what's going to happen if, and is this going to be enough to be clear? So long story short, use the appraisal gap that Seth Weissman wrote. If you are with a seller and you get an appraisal gap clause that are one of these other variations and have this happen, get calls about it, counter back, strongly encourage the seller to counter back to remove the special stip that they proposed in their offer and to replace it with this one. Oftentimes they're super happy. They weren't really thinking about it. They were just in a hurry. And this accomplishes what they needed to accomplish and also accomplishes what we needed to accomplish if we do find ourselves in a tough spot. Whatever difference this buyer is agreeing to pay, for those of us who work with sellers, it's a good idea to see proof of funds. So hasn't been a problem for a minute, but it can be a problem where a buyer overextends. They're agreeing to pay maybe 30,000 difference, but they really only have 15. Who knows what the thought pattern is on the other side, but if they don't have the cash, what good is a special stipulation? Because sellers are capped at that earnest money. So it's not necessarily not going to help anybody if the stipulation can't be backed up.
Yeah.
All right, so that was a mouthful about special stips, but I think I pretty much got out what I wanted to say on that. So I'm going to push back a little bit and go back to the purchase and sale. And if you guys are thinking, well, it's all about that earnest money, that doesn't seem fair. Well, it's really not all about the earnest money. Keep in mind that a party who defaults, there is a default section of the GAR contract, and it talks about more than just earnest money. It also talks about commission and a party possibly having to pay that if they default. But when parties ask us, what could happen to me if I default on this deal? Don't stress out about feeling like you have to have all the answers. This is a case where I don't want you to really have the answer because you aren't their legal counsel. We aren't even their legal counsel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to snip it. I'm going to show them that default section. I'm going to tell them where to look and say, this is what I want you to look at. If this bothers you, if you have more questions about this, you may want to talk to an attorney who can really help you. Sure, I can say that most oftentimes it's just the earnest money because that is true. But we have no control over who that party is on the other side or who their broker is. Okay, you guys. So quickly before we move on, I want to head back to that signature page now of the contract. This page is super simple. It's just going to be the signatures for the parties. I usually don't list their contact information unless they are a customer. Because notice to the broker if there's a client, notice to us is notice to the client when there's a client relationship. That's why when we get anything, we want to pass it along to the party that we're working with as soon as possible. I would do the same thing with a customer as well, but a customer is responsible for receiving their own notices. So the seller, in this case, I would put an email address, an address, a phone number, but definitely an email address, so I can at least show if I needed to that documents were sent to them. You're required, of course, to enter your company that you work for, the license number, your name, and your license number. If you're on a team, I still want you to put your name and your license number there. I don't want you to solo put the name of the team. The team is not licensed with the Georgia Real Estate Commission. The true agent working the deal needs to have their name and their license number here. Of course, your contact information is going to be there. Binding agreement date is probably the most important date in the GAR contract. And because of the fact that it's the date that all the time frames are measured from. So that date is the date that you receive back the fully accepted contract without any changes. So we sign it on our buyer side, we send it over to the seller, we get notice, we get a ding back that the seller signed it. that is the binding agreement date. If somebody emailed it to us today, but we just didn't happen to check our email until tomorrow, today would technically still be that binding date. If there's an incorrect binding date, you have a day. You have a day to raise your hand and try to get it fixed, and the contract would need to be amended. Luckily, you don't have too many problems. It's been a minute with the binding agreement date, but it is important, especially when buyers have very short time frames. Every single day is going to matter.